When it comes to general strategies for solving an ethical problem, you have to be able to gather the facts about the situation, understanding the clinical, the individual, the personal, the contextual preferences with regard to the situation. You have to be able to identify what type of ethical problem it is, determining which ethical principles are involved. So we have to decide, is this ethical distress? Is it a dilemma? Is it a locus of authority issue? And which principles? Is it beneficence? Is it non malfeasance? Is it justice? Is it veracity, fidelity, whatever the principle is? Then you also have to clarify the professional duties in the situation. And this is where you are going to look at the professional code of ethics that is in place for whatever profession you are involved in. What is the required conduct? So, what is it that's okay to do, and what is it that a person should not do? Also, in solving an ethical problem, you're going to explore the alternatives. What is the desired outcome and consequences of actions? But then, what are some alternatives? What are potential outcomes and consequences of those alternative courses of action? And then when you determine a course of action that you're going to follow, you carry it out and then evaluate the process and the outcome. Being able to decide on an action to take comes as a result of understanding the steps and looking at situations in which there are these conflicting elements. So there are some ethical frameworks that are used for helping to process ethical dilemmas. Not every decision requires the application of a framework. It depends on the scope of the ethical dilemma that you are approaching. But the ethical frameworks provide a common approach, and they allow for that consistency that I mentioned earlier. And they also are tools for guiding the ethical decision-making process. You can use these for ethical issues, whether they are applying to clinical situations or organizational ethical issues. They allow for analysis, deliberation, and resolution, and helping to be able to align decisions with the values, duties, and principles of both the participants and the organization. One of these ethical decision-making frameworks is the IDEA framework. And the IDEA stands for the four steps that are part of this framework. This is set up to be able to help a person, as I said, be able to process an ethical decision making. And this particular framework is made up of 4 steps that incorporate 5 different conditions that have been identified as important within the framework. You have the handout for this framework, and I'll flip to that in a second. But the 4 steps that make up the acronym are identify the facts, determine the relevant ethical principles, explore the options, and act. And those will sound familiar because we talked about these steps within the general process. What are the facts? What are the principles involved? What are our options? And then what action are we going to take? What's a little bit different about this one is it also includes 5 conditions that should be met. The first condition being empowerment, where there should be efforts in engaging in ethical decision making. There should be efforts taken to minimize the power differential in the decision making process. So nobody should be, for example, coercing someone else into taking someone's side. Think of this, one of the things that I thought of in looking at this framework is a jury pool. So a jury goes out for deliberation, and there should be equal weight that each juror has because there's no one who has more authority. However, there is a leader, there's a jury foreperson, But then, sometimes that people are so strong in their beliefs that they try to coerce the other jurors into a guilt or not guilt. So under this framework, we're trying to say that in an ethical decision-making process, there should be efforts taken to minimize that power differential. No one should have more power than anyone else. The second condition is publicity. So there should be transparency in the process, and that's what publicity is meaning. Nothing should be happening behind closed doors. People should be able to understand the process that's being undertaken. Relevance means that the decisions that are made need to be based on reason. It has to be based, and by reason, it's evidence, it's principles, it's arguments, and it's the process of fair-minded people engaging in the discussion. Revision and appeals just simply means opportunities to revisit the decisions. Maybe there's additional evidence or argument that happens. There should be a mechanism to be able to challenge and dispute the resolution. So we learn new information, so we need to be able to go back and revisit what happened. And then compliance or enforcement is just the method of ensuring that all of the 4 previous conditions are met. So how do we go about that process? Oh, actually, I have the slide here. So you have the framework that I handed out to you yesterday, but also here's an image that outlines this particular framework. And it starts intentionally. The design of this has the light bulb in the middle so that it can, you have the idea, is this actually an ethical issue? And they have provided some guiding questions to make that determination. Yoda, I just included this because who doesn't love a model named Yoda? This is a Canadian model. It was one I was not familiar with prior to putting together this lecture, so I have not used it. But again, it's pretty much follows the same process, includes the same things as some of the other ones. What was interesting about this one is the Y starts with U, and that's a reminder that everyone is responsible for fostering an ethical work environment and culture. And, I think that's a good thing for people to always remember. The second is observe. You have to be able to identify the problem. Where is the conflict happening? Acknowledge the feelings. What are people's gut reactions? What are their biases? So this is the one of those where you really need to, once you know what the problem is, okay, let's start processing what are my values and beliefs and what are the values and beliefs and biases of other people involved. What are the facts of the situation? The D is for deliberate. So that's the process of looking at what the other options are, what other alternatives, and then what are the consequences of those. Examining the values, that really involves what are the preferences of the patient, or how do the organizational values affect or inform the issue, and evaluate alternatives again. The A in Yoda is act, which is to articulate the decision. So putting out there what happened, what was our decision, implementing that decision. And actually there's a step 9 here that's missing. That's a concluding review, which is again processing and evaluating the results. This is the other model that I gave you in the handout yesterday. That tends to be the one that is used most widely in a variety of healthcare fields. So you have this one in another packet of things that I gave you yesterday. So it's some of the same processes. We're going to identify the issue, look at our personal and professional values, be able to then look at the influencing factors and barriers, and that's and things like the organizational structure, medical facts, what is the person's diagnoses, and what are some of the barriers that are being encountered. What are those guiding ethical and legal principles? Autonomy, non-malfeasance, justice, privacy, confidentiality, all of those factors. Analyze those alternatives. Remember, dilemmas have two competing issues, so what are the alternatives? Finding common ground, and that's an important one. We talked about that a bit yesterday. So those aspects of finding common ground, are we able to find common ground through collaboration and working together and coming to a consensus? Are we able to make a compromise? We talked a lot yesterday about compromise. Are there acceptable trade-offs? Are there conditions that we're willing to accept in this situation? Accommodation. Now, that's not quite as a collaborative process, and that's when one side just agrees. They agree with the other side. They don't want to argue about it anymore. Coercion is that power imbalance, like I described in the jury room. So they're, coercing the other person into making a decision. And then avoidance is you just evade the whole situation completely. So, there are various ways to find common ground. Some are better than others in terms of the ability to, for everyone to be happy in the process and be able to come up with the best option. The next step in this one is decide and act. So making that decision and taking action, and again, being able to assess those outcomes. So you can look at those frameworks that I gave you yesterday. Now, this is what we were going to do in class yesterday, but we ended up doing the debate, which was great. We were going to look at an ethical issue and apply an ethical framework. We may circle back to this, but start thinking about this now. So I gave an ethical issue of prohibitive costs of care for the needy and asked you to pick a position. So we have that society has a responsibility to ensure that health cares are right for everyone. Society has a responsibility to provide for those who can't afford health care. Not really sure how I feel about this. Those who can't afford health insurance should be required to work for it, and healthcare is an earned privilege. Those with resources should benefit. So we were going to have you work with a partner and try to use one of the ethical frameworks. I won't have you do that right now. We may circle back to that at some point. That's it for this one. I'm going to next put up the physician-assisted suicide information.